Hey everybody, it's me, Dennis, host from the Upper Lot podcast, a Dutch Universal podcast. I would like to introduce this episode for Universal Studios Singapore, a park that's been in the making since 2007, a park that opened on the 28th of May in 2011, a park that's been voted the top amusement park in Asia on TripAdvisor for 6 years in a row, who received 3 million visitors only in their first year. It's a park with an interesting history, with the backdrop of a casino and a resort, with an investment made 4.5 billion euros to build, with a size of 50 hectares. It's an interesting park with a lot of interesting IPs, a lot of interesting rides, a lot of ideas that have been recycled from the failed Dubai project. What's the park really about? Lee, I invite you to tell the story.
Hello and welcome to the TripOn podcast. You just heard some quick facts by Dennis from the Upload podcast from the Netherlands by Nicky and Dennis. My name is Lee.
My name is Alex, and we're an architect and filmed entertainment professionals who travel a lot, and we're also interested in urban development and attractions.
And this is an episode in the series Entertainment. And if you want to see the images for this episode, check our Instagram or triponpodcast.com.
And this time we're going to do it differently. I will be the host and Lee is going to tell about his experience in Universal Studios Singapore.
It was a bit different this time because I managed to go there. I had a bit of spare time in Singapore.
But maybe before we move into that, it will be nice to just introduce Singapore. Singapore is exceptionally prosperous economy in Southeast Asia. And the entire country is an island which became a sovereign country since 1859. You could say also a little bit more about Sentosa Island, so where the park is actually located.
Sentosa Island is a holiday destination for many of the Singaporeans, and there was already always a collection of hotels and holiday parks and water parks and a beautiful collection of beaches. But also that is the home of a very integrated holiday destination, which is a collection all done by the same investor, and they also are the ones behind the Universal Studios Singapore Park right there. We will get more into detail about Singapore as a city, but also Sentosa Island in a later episode, because there's just a lot to talk about.
So let's talk about the background and the context of your visit.
Interestingly, we visited Singapore around Christmas. So it was also, again, a very interesting experience to be in a tropical environment in Southeast Asia during Christmas. And I think something very similar happened over here as what we saw in Dubai, is that they truly adopt the American way of celebrating Christmas.
Yeah, they even had a Christmas market in Gardens by the Bay.
Because I was literally in the park on the 26th of December. Of course, that comes with a lot of decorations and Christmas celebrations and Christmas music and all that stuff. But I think besides that, you can also say that it was obviously a holiday locally, so it was really crowded. That was maybe the one downside about it. It is very easy to reach. It is really easy to get there from the city center. So there is a way to get to a monorail station on the mainland. And from there, you just hop on the monorail, and the monorail takes you onto Sentosa Island. And that monorail's first stop on the island is actually right next door of Universal Studios. So it really drops you off in the resort, which is called Resorts World Sentosa. I was there, of course, for the very first time. I was looking around like, whoa, I didn't expect this project to be so impactful and so impressive. But I was, of course, going with one goal, so I really quickly made it to Universal Studios and I went inside.
And how much time did you spend in the park?
I spent, I think, in total about 5.5 hours, I think.
I'm also quite curious how familiar you were with the park before the visit and what were your expectations?
Universal Studios Singapore is actually quite well known, especially, I think, amongst industry professionals. One thing that everyone knows is that Universal Studios Singapore is very small. It's the smallest Universal park that exists in the world. Universal Studios Singapore is not in itself the main attraction on Sentosa Island. It is just there amongst a lot of other stuff that people come for. amongst which one of the most important things is the big casino that is there, because Singapore doesn't have a lot of casinos, and one of the main casinos of the city is on the island. So I was familiar with the park for a couple of reasons. First of all, of course, you are familiar with the fact that there is a Universal Studios in Singapore. Second of all, I was quite familiar with the park because I followed its construction and development. The park opened in 2011. It was built around 2009, 2010. And I was already very much interested in the industry around that time. So I consciously actually saw the construction of that park. And besides that, I know people who worked on it. And I had really nice conversations with those people about, how complicated that actually was. And also, it is often a little bit considered the weakest of the Universal Studios parks. And jokingly, also in the Dutch podcast, the Upperlot podcast, they are always discussing Universal Studios as a whole, as a company, but also the parks are a very important subject in their podcast. And funnily enough, always when this park comes up, they kind of say like, yeah, nothing really happened there. Let's move on. Because it is just a park that just doesn't really go through a lot of innovations and development, not like the other Universal Studios.
The least taken care of, maybe.
Well, it is probably the park that is the least actively overseen by Universal Studios themselves. This is definitely a licensing deal.
And now we'll go to the next item, which is the head, the heart, and the base. We decided to divide our episodes into 3 parts. The head, which is the very first impression about the place. The heart, which is more about the experience in itself. And the base, which is the trail from the visit and what will stay with us. So let's first go to the head, so the first impression. And I would like you to walk me through your first moments when you were entering and what stood out to you.
So I took the monorail from mainland Singapore in this case. And when you're in the monorail, you actually pass in front of the main street of Universal Studios, which is completely themed according to Hollywood. And from the windows of the monorail, you can really look into the main street. And then it actually continues because that's not where the station is. So it's really smart how they set it up, that it's kind of like the perfect marketing that everyone who takes the monorail sees Universal Studios Singapore. And then
it's a teaser.
You can literally say that the monorail is kind of the entrance because the ticket check is literally under the monorail track. So you're kind of like looking into the park. The monorail station is called Sentosa World Station. And there you get off the monorail and there you actually walk up to the kind of the central plaza of the entire resort. It's a really well set up, really well designed central plaza where you have really like this world of entertainment offerings around you. There's this one opening on your right hand when you walk up to this central plaza, and in the middle of this opening, this kind of like open courtyard, there is a giant Universal Studios globe rotating. And that globe is so iconic.
It's a good photo op.
It's a very good photo op. Yeah, the thing is also you don't even have to visit the park to be on a photo with the globe because the globe is standing right there. And then behind that globe is a very big gate with Universal Studios Singapore on top. And you walk under the gate, there's the ticket check. The monorail track is right above you. And you pass the ticket check and you immediately walk into Universal Studios Main Street. So this Main Street is themed like Hollywood. And that's a very common thing in the Universal Studios parks. They often have a Hollywood zone or a Hollywood-themed street. And in this case, it's the same. The thing that does really stand out to you immediately is that it is a roofed main street. And this is something that you see more often, especially in Asia. They also had a roofed main street in Universal Studios Japan and also in Disneyland in Tokyo. And in Beijing, Universal Studios, they also have it. So it's something that they often do to shade from the sun, but also because it often rains in these tropical countries. So if it would rain, the main street is still accessible.
So if we're already inside of the park, how is actually the layout of the park and how did you decide to move around?
Yeah, this park is a very, very classic layout. Like I said, the big globe in front the main gate and then the main street, but then you also walk up to a body of water in the center of the park. And the park zones are actually laid out around the lake in a circular shape. And in this park, there are 7 themed lands. So you walk into Hollywood, and then in counterclockwise direction, you have on the right side, when you come in on your right hand, you have New York, which transitions into Sci-Fi City, then Ancient Egypt, then The Lost World, all the way in the back, which is basically Jurassic Park, then Far, Far Away, and that's the land themed like the world of Shrek. And then formerly there was Madagascar, which is basically on your left hand when you walk into the park, which means that you already made the whole circle. And that was, when I was there, being completely changed into the Minion Land. So it was closed, but currently already it's open.
So let's move to the heart, your actual experience in the park. And my first question would be if you can maybe walk me through the rest of your day.
I immediately went, when I arrived into the park, I went into the direction of New York. I went right at the end of the Hollywood Main Street. And from New York, it transitions into Sci-Fi City. And there was actually the main ride that I was interested in is the Transformers, the ride. That is a ride which also exists in other Universal Studios parks. So it's not unique to Singapore in any way, but I've never ridden that ride. So I was really curious to experience that because people are always saying that it is one of the better dark rides in the world. So the ride system for this dark ride is pretty legendary. It's very similar to the dark ride system of The Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man in Orlando's Islands of Adventure. And that is by far considered one of the best dark rides ever. I would say, I think even a lot of people have it in their top 3 or top 5. So I kind of was expecting a lot from this ride. And I think we will go a bit more into detail later, but that ride was not, it was not really on the level that I expected it to be. From there on, I continued counterclockwise. So I went through Sci-Fi City and then to Ancient Egypt. There's a really big ride over there, the Mummy. Then in the back, The Lost World, there is another major ride, which is a water ride. And then in Far, Far Away, there are a couple of big rides. And they actually, one of them is unique to Universal Studios Singapore. And unfortunately, when I was there, the Minions Land expansion was still under construction. So that whole part of the park was closed. I had to, of course, skip that part. So I actually made the decision to also do the major rides next to the rides that I was focusing on.
So while talking about the rides, what were your standout experiences?
I would have to preface that with that this is a typical Universal Studios park. So there are a couple of clones in this park that you will be able to find in other parks too. So in this case, the Transformers Dark Ride also exists in other parks, but it is of course considered one of the major dark rides that Universal Studios developed. So I was riding that immediately when I came in, and for me, I was a bit disappointed. I don't know if it's specifically the one in Singapore, but it was for me very chaotic. A lot was happening, a lot of explosions, a lot of spectacle. It was a bit reckless in a way. It was very loud. It was just a bit too much for me. It didn't really create any nice atmosphere or a good storytelling, or it was just a bit much. And I would definitely not consider that to be on the same level as Spider-Man in Islands of Adventure. So that wasn't the best introduction, I would have to say. But I do understand why people think that it is a major dark ride, because it is. You can see that there's quite a high production value. It's just that it's a bit heavy on screens and CGI. That's just a downside for me.
So there are not that many animatronics or props in the dark ride?
There's not so many physical set pieces in there. I mean, there is a bit, so it's a mix of animation and physical. But I think the main reason why it is so popular is probably because the IP Transformers was just really popular. And I think that is the main draw. I do have to say that the Transformers as characters, which also appeared here for meet and greets in the park, they were still very popular. People wanted to take photos with them. They're very popular. Bumblebee and Megatron. I do understand the appeal of the IP. Another unique ride to Singapore is the Battlestar Galactica coaster. And this is a battling coaster by Vekoma. It's a very well-known coaster amongst the industry professionals, but also amongst coaster enthusiasts. And to be honest, it was very cool to see that for real and to be able to ride it. And that's a coaster with a very interesting past, but more importantly, that only exists in Singapore. So that's also really cool to finally be able to experience that for real. But I think we can talk about that a bit later also. Then there is another big ride over here, which is the Mummy. And the Mummy also exists in a couple of other Universal Studios theme parks. I experienced the Mummy for the very first time in 2005. When I was in the US for the first time, we went to Universal Studios Hollywood. And I still remember that made a big impression. So it was really nice to experience the Mummy again. And I have to say, still great experience. But I think we also will discuss that a bit later. And then there is also something in this park I think that this park is really well known for, and that's a very prominent castle. And I'm not talking about the Hogwarts castle, because that's different, but like an actual, kind of like a Disney-style castle, and that's the castle of Far, Far Away, based on Shrek. And I was always intrigued by that castle. This is such a ironic thing for Universal Studios to do, because Shrek was always meant to be kind of a parody, and for them then to build a castle almost in Disney style in a Universal Studios park, I don't know, it just feels like they do it on purpose, and it's very like a parody driven decision. There is also a Sesame Street dark ride, which was actually really fun. There is a big water ride in the Lost World, so where many of the other Universal Studios have the classic Jurassic Park ride with the big splash in the end. This park actually has a Jurassic Park river adventure, which is a river rafting ride. So it's a bit different from the other parks. There is an attraction about filmmaking presented by Steven Spielberg. And there's a couple of other things. There's a junior coaster, and there's another family coaster, etc. But those are definitely the standout rides over here.
But if we're talking about the rides, how would you assess the operational efficiency of the park?
I think in general, operations wasn't that bad. It was a very crowded day. It was pretty busy. And I think there is a certain professionality about how they operate the rides. The throughput was quite good. The only thing is that I did notice that many operators weren't maybe the friendliest. They were a bit uninterested, maybe even sometimes a bit rude, where they were just like telling you what to do. They didn't have this American charm. They didn't have the American friendliness in their operation. So not all of them, by the way. There are some people that were really friendly, but I also did notice, but this is something that you always have in theme parks all over the world. And I know because I used to work also in a theme park myself, is that you have this fatigue during those days that is very crowded, that people are just a bit done with it. And I totally understand.
I think it's in general when you work in hospitality that sometimes it might be tough. But of course they should not say or show it. Maybe a bit different topic, but how well do the themed areas communicate their narrative or concept?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, this park really clearly has distinctive themed lands. So if you would say that this park is, like a pizza, and then the lands are basically like the pizza slices, and each land has a very different style. Also design language, thematic approach, architectural style, colors, everything is very different. So in this case, you can say that yes, those different themed lands, they do really, they are very defined. However, the park is incredibly small. Just to give you a bit of context, I actually checked the size of the park, and the size of the entire theme park, including the back of houses, is approximately 16 hectares. And that is a little bit over, for our European listeners, Phantasialand, including the hotels. And that is about half the size of Islands of Adventure from Universal Studios in Orlando. And it's about 1/3 the size of Disneyland Paris. So you can kind of imagine how small that park is, and still it has 7 themed lands and a lake in the middle. So there are just places in the park where you can see in one view 6 lands, or maybe even 7. You can just see all of them. There's not really a transition between the different lands, which also immediately means that it's a bit hard to fully get immersed into a themed land if you can always see the other lands, either towering over it, or you can already see the other lands right next to you because it is just so small.
And so close to each other.
One of the smaller lands in this park is, for example, Sci-Fi City. Sci-Fi City is where the Transformers ride is, but also the Battlestar Galactica battling coasters. And that land, from when you enter the land until you enter the next land, is only about 120 meters. And that is extremely small for a land.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and that land exists, for example, next to ancient Egypt. So you can imagine how big the contrast is between those two. Sci-Fi City is all about steel and silver and futuristic and white and neon lights and all that stuff. And then right next to that, you have ancient Egyptian statues. So yeah, it's a bit difficult to really get immersed in those themes when it's all so packed and cramped together.
And are there any live shows in the park? Did you have a chance to watch any show?
Well, this park, ironically, even though it is so incredibly small, also has Waterworld, which is actually a very famous Universal Studios show, which exists also in Hollywood, Japan, and in Beijing, and also here in Singapore. But that show is known for having a really big arena. So I was a bit surprised, like, oh my God, they have Waterworld, that huge live show with that big arena. So I have to say that I actually visited Universal Studios Japan a couple of months before, in September. And I've seen Waterworld there. And to be honest, I was a bit like, I'm going to skip it here because I've seen it in Japan. That's also supposed to be one of the better ones because all the effects work and it's very spectacular. So I was fine skipping this one. Although I have to say, really good show. And I think probably here in Singapore it's going to be also great because it's a show with really, really impressive special effects. But I skipped it this time. Another thing, although, that was here, especially when I visited, it was very prominent. It's the movie Wicked was in cinemas. And Wicked was a really big thing for Universal Studios. And the New York street was decorated with Wicked images and Wicked decorations. And on the meet and greet stage, there was this show every once in a while where big doors opened and then there was this robotic head of the wizard, all in the style of the movie. And then later the two witches would appear and you could also meet with them and take photos with them. And I didn't expect it to be so incredibly popular. There was like a true very, very long queue line for people who wanted to take photos with the witches. So I think it is also a pretty, it was a very successful movie also, Wicked, in the cinema. It was a big thing for Universal Studios. So, you can imagine that in such a small park, that was a prominent thing. It really took over the Hollywood street. Besides that, it was Christmas. And specifically for Christmas, they also played the DreamWorks Animation Holiday Spectacular, which was a video mapping projection show on the Far, Far Away castle. And of course, I also watched that show. No, there was also a Christmas parade, I remember. And when the Christmas parade was going through the park, it's such a small park that the parade was actually a bit in the way when you wanted to make use of the main pathways. But the Christmas parade was going through the park. And when that happened, the queue lines were, of course, immediately much calmer. So it was ideal. I didn't really watch the parade. Of course, you can imagine the parade. It's like floats with the minions and, with all the characters, with Shrek and all that stuff. And while it was happening, I was watching it a little bit. Of course, Christmas music and everything. But I was like, that's a really good opportunity for me to ride some rides. So I immediately took that opportunity to benefit from the shorter queue lines.
So because you've mentioned Universal in Orlando or in Beijing or Japan, I'm actually curious if you noticed any localization in the park storytelling, like references tailored to Southeast Asia or Singaporean culture?
Yeah, I think this answer is pretty clear. And the answer is no. This is a typical Universal Studios park with a very Hollywood general theme, and it is heavily based on the IPs, and it doesn't really do anything with the fact that it is in Singapore. But I have to be honest that also something very similar happens with Universal Studios in Japan. It's mostly just either a direct clone or copy of the existing lands in the US-based parks that they would just build in the other Universal Studios parks, or they would a little bit tailor some things towards the local culture, but they would do it with their own IP and not so much with the local IP. So for example, in Japan, in the kids zone, there was actually a bit of Hello Kitty. So there was Hello Kitty F&B outlets, there was Hello Kitty, some sort of like indoor thing, indoor play with a couple of attractions, and Hello Kitty merchandise. So there was a bit more tailored to Japan, but here in Singapore, I didn't see anything tailored to Singapore, to be honest. So yeah, that was also a bit of a missed opportunity, I would say.
Since you've mentioned merchandise, I'm actually curious, how was the retail and food experience in the park? If there were diverse options or some strong theming or maybe some signature items like that Hello Kitty in Japan?
Generally, Universal Studios is normally very good with their own merchandise, and also this park had their own merchandise line, so there were a lot of items that you could buy with specifically Universal Studios Singapore on it, or like with the item actually being designed for Universal Studios Singapore. Besides that, of course, there is a lot of IP-based merchandise over here. Also here, Madagascar, Kung Fu Panda, Shrek, How to Train Your Dragon, all of that stuff you can also find here. That is always very good. The quality is generally really good of that merchandise. It is very expensive, obviously, but I think that you can expect that. But I have to say, I did manage to find some really nice things that were specifically merchandise lines for Universal Studios Singapore. Besides that, I would say that the main shop or retail is definitely in the Hollywood Main Street. Those shops are amazing, really big, and also at the end of the day, full of people, of course. And then you always see, when you just stand in those stores and you just look at how people spend their money, you're always like, they must probably earn their money back already from everything that they had in operational costs today, because people really, truly buy a lot of merchandise in these parks. But I do have to say that generally the park is very weak with retail in the park itself. There are a couple of shops that were a bit decent, but I also noticed that a lot of the retail is probably not currently operating in the form that it was originally designed in. So I noticed that many of the photo points, for example, in attractions are completely closed or changed, so that it was much simplified with less operators, and also have the feeling that some of the exit shops of the rides are completely gone. So they used to be maybe there, but they're no longer there. Like they've been literally taken away. And it was a bit awkward because you can just feel that a space was supposed to be a retail space, but it wasn't anymore. And I think that the park has been cutting that kind of stuff.
Okay, interesting. Maybe it wasn't as popular in those specific places or attractions.
Yeah, maybe that, or maybe the operational costs were too high. I don't know. Maybe also some of the IPs were maybe not as attractive. Like, for example, the Battlestar Galactica coaster, it clearly used to have a more prominent exit shop or more retail at the exit. But at the same time, I was thinking that IP, I don't know if that's still very popular, I don't know. Probably that was just not popular enough anymore to keep like themed or dedicated retail for it open.
Let's go to the trail, the very base of the experience. What will you remember from the visit?
I think what I would mainly remember is that the park is really not that good. I think it kind of confirmed my visit that now I understand what people are talking about when they criticize Universal Studios Singapore. It feels like this park is just there, it carries the Universal Studios name, it carries the IPs, it probably is financially very successful, and maybe that's also the reason why the park just doesn't really develop or invest or evolve. And I think there are a lot of reasons why it feels like a subpar Universal Studios experience. But I think one of the main things in my case is that the one in Japan is generally considered to be a very good one. Not because the park is amazing, because there's also a bit of an awkward collection of IPs in an urban situation that also shows a highway and hotel towers, etc. from the park. So it's definitely not one of the best parks. But the one in Japan has really, really solid maintenance and upkeep, and all the effects work. Amazing employees. They are very friendly, very mannered, very well operated. And the Universal Studios in Japan is a true machine. And I think as a contrast, visiting this Universal Studios a couple of months later, it just maybe for me even solidified that this park is just not on that level at all. Absolutely not. This park is definitely already, I think, in the basis, not that strong, but also currently in its current form, for not being even that old, it's a bit sad to see the state of the park.
Probably would be better if you would first visit the Universal Studios Singapore and then the Japanese one, not the other way around.
Exactly. It was the wrong order. Yeah.
What are your absolute highlights of the park?
That in that day was definitely for me to ride the Mummy again. I really, really like that attraction. I think that is definitely still very much deserved one of those pivotal moments in theme park history, because the Mummy is a true special effects coaster in the dark with a very multi-dimensional character to it. You go slowly through the dark ride scenes. There are really special effects in there. There's fire in there. There are moving figures. Your car come to a full stop in a dead end. It goes backwards. A lot of stuff is happening in that coaster. And even though this is maybe on some aspects not that high level, still as a total experience, that is still a great ride. Really, really strong experience. I think besides that, from the two coasters, from the Battlestar Galactica coaster by Vekoma, you have a Cylon coaster and you have a human coaster. So the Cylons are alien, the humans are of course based on the human characters from the series. And the Cylon coaster is a very, very strong coaster. So Cylon is a suspended coaster, so an inverted coaster. It's a really strong inverted coaster, I have to say. It's a very solid, prominent coaster in a theme park.
Mm-hmm.
I would also have to say that my favorite zone in the park was the Lost World. That's the most green area of the park. A zone like this works really well in a tropical environment because it's very lush and very green, and it really fits this high humid, warm weather. But I think because of that, it is less man-made and more natural. So I think it's also because of that less could go wrong. And it's naturally a bit more shaded. It's also more pleasant to roam around because you have more secondary pathways and there's a bit more discovery. And I think just the theme of Jurassic Park and the live entertainment and the dinosaurs and the music, I really like that IP and the movie. So yeah, that was really nice to experience again.
I would like to move to the next part, which is a preview of you as a theme park professional. And I have a couple of questions that are a bit more specific, or they compare other parks with Universal Studios Singapore. So the first thing I would like to ask you is, do you see any unique design or storytelling elements that set Universal Studios Singapore apart from other theme parks globally?
Well, this is a bit of a tricky one because this park is clearly based on its US counterparts. So it does a lot of things that are already done in other parks. But I have to say that it basically does everything a little bit worse than the other parks. Mainly because there are just aspects of the experiences here of which the quality is obviously lower. So when it does something that the other parks also do, even though in Universal Studios Singapore there might be a more decorated or more thematic approach to it, the quality is just really not good enough. Like, I will give you one example. In some of the other Universal Studios parks, there's also the Transformers ride. But in the other parks, the Transformers Dark Ride is just in a big building, and it's not really themed. It's not also in a themed land. It just is in a big building with a Transformer figure on top of it, and just a name like Transformers the Ride on the building, and that's it. Over here, the Transformers Dark Ride is actually set in Sci-Fi City, and it has a bit of a street in front of it, like a sort of sci-fi main street, you know, with LED panels and with like a kind of a steel futuristic style to it. So you would say that this is actually settled a bit better into a themed environment. But immediately also, as a side note, that themed environment is very, very weak and cheap looking. So it doesn't necessarily improve the experience that much. And I think throughout this whole park, there are instances like that where you're like, it's just not done really well. So it doesn't improve on anything that has been done somewhere else already. I think there's one unique aspect here. And that is, of course, the Shrek themed land, which doesn't exist anywhere else. So you have a far, far away. But I think that this land is still very disappointing, especially because we both visited DreamWorks, the DreamWorks Hall in Motion Gate in Dubai. And not everything in Dubai is on a high level, but that DreamWorks zone in Dubai is so strong. And
yeah, definitely. That zone is really amazingly themed, and it's very magical.
Yeah, exactly. And when you have such a thing to compare to, then it's just baffling that the actual owner of the IP doesn't manage to get a DreamWorks zone in that is better than the one that is done by independent theme park that has the license to that. So yeah, that's the one thing. I would say that one thing that is definitely done better here is the Mummy is in the other parks always kind of a weak frontage or themed area. So, for example, the Mummy in Hollywood is just a hall. You know, again, this is typical studios approach. It's just a hall with the Mummy on it. And that's it. Very poorly themed. So in Orlando it's a little bit more themed, but still it is kind of still set in an environment in front that doesn't really evoke this Egyptian style or Egyptian theme. Over here, you can kind of say that the Mummy has a mini land. And there is a bit more Egyptian theming in front of the Mummy the Ride. So this is the kind of, I would say, the most elaborately themed the Mummy ride, with a bit of an ancient Egypt zone in front of it. But then again, the zone is so incredibly small that it's not really serving as a true themed land. You know, it has a couple of things like an F&B outlet. There's a little round ride also, which is more for families or for kids. But I cannot deny that this is probably the most impressive frontage of a Mummy ride. You know, with decent theming in front, with big statues, with a nice building, well decorated. But then again, the queue line again is really bad. So, you know, it's like there's always an asterisk of, there's always a but, you know, and that's just really sad to have to mention that.
Mm-hmm. Well, there have been critiques about how some parks prioritize IP over innovation. So what's your take on how Universal Singapore handles that balance?
Yeah, well, that's a bit of a Universal Studios thing. I think when you look at the landscape of the big theme parks, and if you always kind of talk about Disney and Universal as the opposites, then Disney is doing a bit more with unique theme parks with an overall theme or approach. And Universal Studios tends to often just replicate the Universal Studios formula in definitely in other countries also. And in this case, I think this park definitely fits that formula. You know, this is a very, very IP-based park. And I think it's even so strongly based on IPs that it maybe forgets a bit to be a theme park. It forgets to do all the stuff that makes a true theme park feel like a nice place to be and walk around and experience. I think one of the things that really confirms this is their latest expansion, so the one that was under construction when I was there, is a Minions Land. And the Minions Land is, I think, generally regarded as one of the weaker lands in Universal Studios all over the place, simply because the Minions, yes, it's fun, it's popular amongst kids, etc. But it's not really a strong IP to base a themed land on. And the main ride in the Minions Land is a simulator ride. And Universal often gets criticism for being very screen-based and to be very heavily depending on screens and simulators. And unfortunately, the next big investment for this park is a simulator. And it's also not a unique ride.
Yeah, and especially that they are removing the Madagascar Dark Ride to replace it with that simulator. So,
exactly, yeah.
That's quite of a pity, because it is full of animatronics and effects, and it will be replaced with screens.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they replace an IP with an IP. And I understand that the Minions is a very strong IP, and I think that Universal makes a lot of money with it. They literally make billions with it. Besides the films, they probably also make a lot of money with the merch. So I get it, but at the same time, it feels very commercial, to make a decision like that. So yeah, it is definitely a very, very strongly IP-based park with every trait that you can imagine.
Are there any disappointments or attractions that didn't quite land in terms of immersion or technology?
Maybe the park overall even disappoints slightly. I think, one of the things that also stand out in that park is that generally the quality of AVL, so audio and video and lighting, is also lacking in this park. And Universal Studios is a Hollywood-based company. And they are normally really strong with, like I said, screen-based rides. So they are normally very strong with content. And unfortunately, in this park, there's some really bad screens, for example. Screens that are either have burn-in or that are not working well, or screens that are simply turned off. There was often problems with sound. I heard a lot of issues with speakers. I even saw speakers that were visually broken. But also lighting was an issue. I really experienced some of the saddest theme park lighting in a major theme park that I've ever seen. Light fixtures that were not hidden, light fixtures that were lighting up parts of the hall that you were not supposed to see. Just way too many examples for a theme park that is under a company that is definitely able to do way better than this. Another thing is that, for example, this park in its entirety misses a defining animatronic. And I think every park, especially every major theme park, should at least have one memorable standout animatronic. There is one animatronic which you can kind of consider as the main animatronic or the most prominent animatronic figure, and that is the Mummy. So Imhotep, which is a very well-known character from the movie. And over here, the Mummy, when he was talking, his jaw was moving sideways. And I don't know, I was just, it was a bit laughable, because I don't understand who comes up with that. So it's just a bit sad to see that this park never really hits the level of what you expect from Universal Studios Park. Another thing that also stood out to me, Cylon, which I earlier said is really an enjoyable coaster, truly a nice coaster, but it is immediately also the worst queue line in terms of theming and decoration in the entire park. Terrible queue line, terrible station. And I'm not saying that it is bad for Universal. I think that is even bad for the entire industry.
Okay, but can you elaborate on that? Why is it so bad?
The area or the zone around the coaster Battlestar Galactica is already pretty weak in terms of its theming quality, because it is mainly just steel, silver panels and stuff like that. So, semi sci-fi modern space theme. And then you walk into the queue line of the ride, and the queue line is all the way until you enter the building. It feels like you're in a cage. It's just like fencing that makes you feel like you're in a cage. Yeah, it's not landscaped or anything. There's no atmosphere, so that's already pretty bad. But then when you enter the building, a big part of the queue line is actually stairs, and those stairs are just concrete, and the walls of those stairs are like highly glossy fiberglass panels that seem to look a bit like it should look like organic material or something. I don't really understand the queue line. I didn't really watch the series. That literally stop at around 3 meters. And it's not like a transition. It just stops at 3 meters. And everything above it is just concrete building with light fixtures and ventilation system and stuff like that. And that's it. And those panels are literally screwed to the wall with visible screws.
Okay, so there is just no attention to the detail.
That quality, and I'm not exaggerating, is what you expect in a cheap ghost train horror ride attraction on a fun fair.
Okay. Do you remember how is crowd control and guest flow managed there compared to other major parks?
Yeah, well, I think I have to immediately say that this park is way too small for its popularity. This park is on such a prominent location in such a rich region, which automatically brings a couple of problems. First of all, the park doesn't really have expansion possibilities because it is blocked by a major road that is situated around the park, so at the back of the park, and immediately next to that road is a golf park. So I think that this park doesn't really have opportunities for expansion. Besides that, this park is a circular layout with a lake in the middle, which means that there is no way to cross the park from one zone to another other than moving around in this primary circulation, in the main primary pathway that loops around the lake. So you always have to go from zone to zone to zone to zone. So if you would like to go from Minions Land now to ancient Egypt, you would have to either pass through Hollywood, New York, and Sci-Fi City, or you have to pass through Far, Far Away, The Lost World, and then into ancient Egypt. So you always have to go from zone to zone to zone to zone. This automatically, of course, causes a series of bottlenecks. And there's not many secondary pathways. So it means that the main circulation, so the main pathway, the primary pathway that runs throughout the entire park, is constantly very crowded. Besides that, because it's a Universal Studios park, it still does the things that a Universal Studios park does, which means meet and greets and parades. And those parades, they do have to make use of the primary pathway. So it's really, really crowded. And it's pretty difficult to move around in the park when those parades are passing by. And also, live entertainment is often blocking stuff or blocking pathways. And another thing that I noticed is that some of the rides very clearly have too small queue lines. So the queue lines had to be extended. And one ride that was really suffering from that is the Sesame Street Dark ride, which is in the Hollywood area. So when you walk into that ride, it has a big marquee, it has an entrance, it has a pretty nice front facade in a Hollywood-style building. You walk into that ride, but at some point you walk outside of the building again through a little door, and then the rest of the queue line is actually in front of the building, so outside the actual show building. And it just shows that there was no space for extended queue lines inside the building, so they had to go for like a plan B. So yeah, I don't know. I think predominantly you can say that this park is just too small in general for its popularity.
That actually leads to my next question. How would you describe the architectural style of the park, both thematically and infrastructurally?
So the Hollywood Street is supposed to portray actual Hollywood architecture, so the real buildings that you can find in Hollywood. This is traditionally done in many of the Hollywood-themed theme parks, is that there's very famous buildings, prominent buildings that exist in Hollywood that mean something to the film industry, and that's also done here. The same with the New York streets. those buildings are not unique. They're actual buildings that exist for real, and they are replicated in the several Universal Studios parks. Also here, but I have to immediately say it is definitely done way cheaper over here, and I would say also less authentic, and actually in many cases worse than in many of the other Universal Studios parks. They make use of, for example, fake windows, fake doors. It lacks detail in general. And what I also saw here, that there are windows where there's just a shiny sticker that represents, for example, the curtains in the window. And maybe it's a bit unfair because I, of course, again, visited Universal Studios Japan, which is considered the most beautiful park when it comes to their replica buildings. So in Japan, the Hollywood area and the streets of New York and the waterfront, the New York waterfront, is incredibly detailed and very, very high quality, very authentic also in its building quality. Balconies, windows, doors, lighting, everything is really, really well done. Even shop windows with props and all sorts of stuff. And just to compare that to this one, it just falls flat. This park definitely doesn't replicate those buildings in any major authentic way. So I have to say the realistic architecture is less convincing. It looks more like a cheap film studio set and not in a good way. And I think in general, I think also the quality of the materials is just lower throughout the entire park. You can see that this park heavily relies on fiberglass and on foam for the decoration. And in many cases, the fiberglass is cracking, bleached. Sometimes it shows a bit of mold or even plants growing out of it. So yeah, that's not good. Also, what I noticed is that, for example, in Sci-Fi City, which is supposed to portray steel and metal, many of the panels over there is just MDF painted in silver. Yeah, many of the glass, let's say, in the park is just plexiglass, so it's not really glass. So in general, it just takes away from the believability of the theming. Then another prominent thing that I have to mention is that, so this park is situated right next to the main hotel. And because of that, also, you can always kind of see the urban environment from the park. So, for example, you can see from a solid part of the park, you can always see the hotel towering over it. So the towers with all the windows. And there is, of course, the monorail that comes by, etc. So it is a bit harder to completely be immersed in the zones when you're able to always see the surroundings. It is a bit recognizable from what I saw in Universal Studios Japan, when there's actually a highway which you can always see from the park. So like a really big highway flyover bridge. And it does take away from the immersion, and it does take away from the believability of the zones.
From an urban planning perspective, what are your thoughts on locating a major theme park in an area like Sentosa?
Yeah, so this entire Resorts World Sentosa project is really massive. We were a bit looking into it, and this project was entirely built in one go. So we saw in the past that there used to be something completely different. I think the island was also a bit more influenced by its colonial history before, and everything that was there before was completely leveled, literally. So everything was taken away, also all the trees and vegetation. And the entire Resorts World Sentosa was built in one go. The entire project consists of multiple hotel resorts and also residential areas. There's a marine life park, there's a casino, there's a holiday park, there's a water park, there's a lot of infrastructure, so also pedestrianized shopping and dining areas. There's, of course, the theme park, in this case, Universal Studios. So you can see that this is a whole man-made area, a whole man-made world. And it's also multi-level, so there's a lot of concrete and a lot of stone. And I think that impact is so big on the island, and a lot of green space and forest was actually sacrificed for it. So it is only justified for the entire company to achieve a more eco-friendly goal and to try to give back to the island, because I can only imagine how much actually the impact is of this entire project.
What's your impression of how the park blends with the tropical environment of Sentosa Island?
Well, ironically, Sentosa Island has a very strong elevation profile. So there's a lot of height differences all over the island because it has a pretty steep hilly range. The highest point is, I think, even more than 60 meters above water level. So you would expect that the natural environment of the island could accommodate a pretty interesting park layout, a bit like what we discussed in Ocean Park in Hong Kong. However, the entire Resorts World Sentosa is incredibly flat. So the entire Universal Studios in Singapore is also really flat. There's almost no height differences there. So it's so man-made. It's almost like a concrete base where they built the entire park on. And also, there is a pretty severe lack of vegetation or trees in the park. The most green area in the park is the Lost World. That was pretty green, and it felt very tropical because there was a lot of vegetation, a lot of trees, nice winding pathways, etc. And it was the most green, the most foresty also, and that's also where the River Rapid ride is set. But it is a bit sad that that character that the island traditionally or naturally had doesn't really translate into what the park became. And also it is at the same time also kind of a missed opportunity for me that there are no real height differences. I would say that no, this park is a very level, very clearly man-made environment.
Which is a little bit a pity because it would be maybe easier to make the transition between the zones and hide it if it would be more hilly.
Yeah, and also normally vegetation and trees, they serve often as a very good transition between themed lands. So I think, again, the size of the park is just in its way in this case.
As someone from the industry, are there any spicy behind-the-scene details or controversies about the park that the general public might not know?
Well, Universal Studios in Singapore is often cited as the park that only exists so that the casino could be built and legally operate. And this is for licensing reasons and for the permit that was given by Singapore. Singapore is a very regulated city-state. It's a bit like Hong Kong. And the story is that the investor really wanted to open a casino and that there was a condition from the government of Singapore where they said that they do have to build an internationally renowned entertainment destination that draws in tourism. And only then they would be able to build their casino. And obviously they found Universal Studios as the license holder, and that might also kind of explain why the park feels like one of the worst major theme parks in the world, because it is kind of a licensing deal that had to be, and I think the main moneymaker is the casino. I think that's one of the first things that I have to mention.
Mm-hmm.
Besides that, Battlestar Galactica is a very well-known coaster, mainly because of its very troubled history. You can kind of say that it was Vekoma's first true new-gen style design. So Vekoma was kind of like moving away from their old heritage, which they very strongly based on Aerodynamics, the company from the US. And they were finally kind of like reinventing themselves, and they were coming with a new, completely new, re-engineered prototype style roller coaster. And it was a new chapter for the company. And it was immediately also one of the most problematic coasters in their history. And they also acknowledged that it was very difficult. The coaster was really troubled. It had very big technical problems. And I think in total, even the ride has been closed for 3 years during the existence of Universal Studios Singapore, simply because the coaster had to be closed because of technical issues and because of re-engineering and redesigning, etc. One of the main things that I remember is that they had major problems with the train, and they had issues with cracking of steel. And one of the things that does stand out is that it opened originally with the human side, so the sit-down coaster, to have 4 seats next to each other. It was a really big train for back then, and now it's a 2-seater. So now you have 2 seats next to each other. So ironically, when I saw that, I immediately thought like, oh yeah, that's true. And I took a photo and I sent it to some guys from Vekoma and I said like, that's a very wide train for 2 seats. And then they just basically sent me back, shut up. We know. That was a headache project. Vekoma really did take that problem very serious and they did re-engineer and they did really make that thing run well. Now it is a really, really good coaster and it runs really well. And I think also that coaster might have been a very important coaster for Vekoma to really learn about their new design and their new generation. And I think they only got out of that stronger. And then another very controversial thing, which you probably can guess.
Well, I would say it's going to be about the Madagascar zone.
Exactly. The removal of the entire Madagascar zone. And with that, one of the major rides of this park, the Madagascar Dark Ride. The park decided for a new investment, which is the Minions Land, to remove the entire Madagascar zone. And there was truly a big dark ride, which was unique to Universal Studios Singapore, entirely about Madagascar. It was a very long ride. I think it was about an 8-minute ride experience, which is very, very decent. It had big scenes. It was very impressive in general with its scenography, with its lighting, with its storytelling, but also there were a lot of figures in there. The ride was entirely about the animals when they were in cargo of the ship and they were being shipped overseas, and then they went overboard and then they ended up in all sorts of crazy settings. Not only the ride itself and the ride experience itself was pretty impressive, but also the ride's building. So the show building was pretty impressive. It was completely decorated as the ship with the boxes on it. And I still remember that I really liked the design approach to that zone and to that building when I saw that. And unfortunately, it was demolished already when I was there, so I was never able to ride it. And unfortunately also, it was replaced with a copy-paste Minions Land, and the headliner attraction is a Minions simulator, which is basically a screen-based 3D/4D experience, and that instead of a multi-scene water-based dark ride. It's baffling decision, and I do really understand the controversy of it. Because I think that, yes, maybe Madagascar wasn't as strong as an IP anymore, but you don't have to sacrifice an entire dark ride for that, I would say. You know, especially you get rid of the building, the ride system, the scenes, everything. You could have also reskinned or repurposed that ride because that was a major ride for the park.
Yeah, it's, I think, definitely a pity.
Yeah.
Are there any rumors or upcoming changes you've heard about the park or Sentosa that you find exciting or maybe even a bit concerning?
Universal Studios Singapore will get Super Nintendo World. And it has been delayed a couple of times, so it's still not open. It was promised for 2025. Super Nintendo World already existed in Universal Studios Hollywood and in Universal Studios Japan. It also opened in Epic Universe, and now it will open exactly the same in Universal Studios Singapore. So this shows you that Universal Studios is much more run like a franchise. It is much more copy-paste than, for example, Disney. Nintendo World is a great land. I mean, it is pretty impressive what they pull off. However, it has one big major issue, and that's capacity. The rides are way too popular for their hourly capacity, for their throughput, as we call it. And I am of the opinion that Super Nintendo World should have been much bigger already from the beginning. I just don't understand why they keep on copying this land so small. Because in some of the parks, especially in Japan, the land is so popular that you cannot just walk in. You have to book a time slot. I do think, however, that Super Nintendo World is a good fit for Universal Studios Singapore. It is a very small land, very compact, and I think it also really fits with the Universal Studios vibe in Singapore. It's very plasticky, so it's all fiberglass, which automatically means that it's going to need quite some maintenance to keep on looking well. Where you formerly had the Madagascar-themed area, it is now split in two. So Minions Land and Super Nintendo World are going to be built there. So you can see how small this park is building its themed zones.
How do you think the presence of Resorts World Sentosa, I mean the casinos, hotels, also the aquarium, affects the park's identity and design?
You can feel that this is not the main attraction for this destination. There is almost no innovation or renewal, and it seems even like the park is still hitting all the targets when it comes to its popularity. And I also think that it probably even hits a lot of really, really good financial targets. I can imagine that this must be really popular, being the only major park in a region like Singapore, where generally the population is pretty rich. It's always busy, and I think that's also kind of the problem. Maybe the problem with the park is the success of the park. It kind of, holds it back, the park, to actually innovate and do something new. So there's no real need for major investments because of that. One of my best friends was in Singapore. He went to Universal Studios Singapore, and he was unfortunately there on a day when it was pretty bad weather, and it was even at some point stormy weather, and there was lightning. And because of that, he said more than half of the rides were not operating. And it was such a baffling experience for him. And he said there was nothing to do in the park. They were really quickly done. That he complained with Universal Studios, and they gave a really big part of his ticket money back. For him, it was just a really, really bad aftertaste. And I think that is maybe, what this Universal Studios kind of has attached to it, that the last big investment was not even an expansion, but it was a replacement. So I would be really curious what would be their next investment without having to sacrifice something in the park, because there is almost no space to work with.
Yeah, that's the tricky part, that probably in order to build something new or up to date, they just have to remove something that was already there.
Yeah.
As a theme park professional, what lessons do you think urban designers or architects can take from this park?
I think if I would look at it a bit more as a broader picture, whatever you even think of Resorts World Sentosa, or whatever you think of this park, I think you still have to acknowledge how impressive it is, how this whole thing is set up. It's a very impressive interconnected destination. There is a highly efficient use of space. You can imagine that if this investor got their hands on this plot of land, which is relatively small, and they managed to put so much in it, yeah, that's just really, really impressive from an architectural point of view. There's a very multi-level approach to it. So the main architectural structures are all, I think, based on a very large concrete plate that kind of serves as the ground floor. But there's a lot of stuff happening under there. So the casino, for example, is mostly under that. And besides that, there's a very diverse offering of hotels and resorts and many different attractions and leisure offerings. And everything is really well connected, consciously laid out like that. Besides the fact that you also have several ways to actually move from or towards this place. So you have the monorail that is connected directly to the mainland, but there's also a cable car system, which we actually used. So, infrastructurally, it truly feels like a very well thought out and impressive entertainment destination. And what I especially appreciate is the open character of this whole project. So it seems like the Singapore government doesn't really allow for something like this to be closed or to be privatized entirely. It seems like the government kind of enforces the majority of this project, but also of the island, to be publicly accessible.
And if you could redesign one area of the park, what would you change and why?
First of all, I have to say I would have never removed the Madagascar Dark Ride. Maybe not even to save the IP, but to not destroy an asset, a dark ride, show building, dark ride system, and scenes like that. But, that happened already, so that's nothing we can do about that anymore. I definitely want to say that Shrek needs a way better signature ride. It's very weak right now. The 4D cinema is way overdue. It feels very dated. Besides the fact that the pre-show spaces and the post-show spaces look very bad and pretty cheap, it also is a very prominent building. So the castle is pretty impressive, and it's visible from the entire park. So that building needs a way better ride than just this 4D cinema ride, because this ride I've even experienced in Movie Park Germany, So exactly this right in their cinema. So, it's not unique enough to be very attractive. I think also Battlestar Galactica, it's a very solid coaster, but it is just really ugly in terms of theming. And I think the entire Sci-Fi City Zone, it just doesn't really hit the mark for me. It looks cheap instead of really futuristic. So I would change that theme. I was thinking about two approaches to this. Either you could retheme that entire area. Yeah, you could actually make it an extension of the New York streets. So you would actually incorporate the coaster into the New York streets. Or you would be able to retheme the entire Battlestar Galactica coaster into the ancient Egypt zone. So you would actually incorporate it into the next zone on the other side. That way you create a bigger zone. And I think it also would make the transition a bit less awkward from going from sci-fi into ancient Egypt right now. I think another thing is that this is the only Universal Studios park in the world without a Harry Potter themed land. And Harry Potter is known to be a massive moneymaker, and also it is, generally also really well done. So I think if they would ever consider to expand, they either would have to replace something again in the park, and in that case I was thinking about it, they could consider to replace the Waterworld theater, which is pretty big, and you could do something with that plot of land in the theme of Harry Potter, or maybe they should just consider to buy the golf park, which is right behind the park, and then actually continue the theme park over there. But that's maybe a bit of a big ask. That golf park has been there for a really long time. I don't know if they even would have, the opportunity to purchase that land. But it could be a future expansion. And I would say that if they would build something Harry Potter related, that would probably immediately bump up the quality of the park. I do also think that maybe then also the rest of the park has to really up their game to hit that same quality, because it would also stand out probably.
Where do you see weaknesses or areas for improvement in the park? In terms of the design, maybe operations?
Definitely number one, maintenance. That is a operational policy. It is already not the prettiest park, but then to see also really poor maintenance, that is just unacceptable, because this park, it is already not changing a lot, so it needs more love, to keep things up. And, the maintenance is just on such a low level that I'm quite surprised that Universal Studios is allowing that, to be honest. I would even say that sometimes the maintenance is so bad that it becomes even maybe a bit of a safety concern. I've seen steel that was so rusted that it was actually deteriorating. Electrical wiring or cabling that didn't really seem safe anymore. Speakers that were completely eroded by water damage. I don't know. I wouldn't really allow this level of maintenance if I would be Universal Studios. So that's definitely something that they could immediately improve on if they would change the policies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's something you can spot even when you're not a theme park professional. And another point on our list are grumpy minutes. Is there anything that you would like to add?
I was absolutely baffled by the fact that it was so full and that so many F&B points were closed. I really don't understand that. There was a giant lack of capacity in F&B, and it was extremely busy, and still many of the points were closed. So that is just really unacceptable. Besides that, because the park is so small, when they are doing a investment like, for example, Minions Land, you immediately miss, I would say, roughly 1/6 of the park because the entire zone was closed, and it takes away a lot of capacity. It takes away a lot of the infrastructure in the park, and also the pathways were way narrower because of it. Yeah, that really impacted the day, I would say.
Do you have any advice for first-time visitors, either from Pro's eye or as a fellow theme park fan?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to say, think twice if you really want to go here. I would say that if you're there, if you have enough time in Singapore to really experience the city, for example, and if you have a lot of time on your hand, then yes, you could consider going here. But if you are especially looking to visit a Universal Studios theme park because you're really interested in that, this is not your best pick. Go to Orlando to see the true Universal Studios magic, or go to Hollywood to see the actual film studios operate and to see the origins of Universal Studios. I do think also that this park has something that we often see in Asian parks, is that all the way at the end of the day, past dinner time, it tends to actually get calmer. So it seems like many people, maybe the people that are on the resort or people that choose to maybe eat outside of the park, they leave. So I noticed that later during the day, so somewhere past maybe 6 or 7 o'clock p.m., the waiting times dropped for the major rides. So it was really nice. I was able to actually rewrite some rides later during the day. So that's also one thing, yeah. Of course, because it's so small and it has such a big theater, I think that during a major show, like for example Waterworld, or during a parade or a meet and greet, the nearby queues also tend to drop immediately in waiting times. So that's also beneficial if you would like to experience something.
I would like to hear, how did you rate this experience in our theme park review form?
So first of all, before I say something, what is your expectation? What do you estimate my rating is?
I think around 5.5 out of 10.
Okay, so 5.5 is somewhere between neutral and okay. I rated the park 5.6, so you were very close.
Okay, that's quite close.
Yeah, and I think the things that the park specifically scored low on was the park's state and upkeep, of course, concerning the maintenance. And also it scored very low on the implementation of or with natural elements. That's exactly the stuff that we talked about. Also, it scored low on authenticity and material integrity, because like I said, the general production value is just really low in this park. Maybe I was a bit more tough on this park also because it is a Universal Studios park, so you kind of expect certain things from a park like that.
Yeah, and because you've been to Japan before, so I think the bar was a bit higher.
Maybe if I wasn't in Japan before, it would have scored higher. That's true.
What we usually do is we try to decide if a place or a location is a trip-on, consider, or a trip-off. And this is basically to give our advice for people who maybe consider to visit a place. So I'm actually quite curious, what would you go for?
I would say Universal Studios Singapore for me is a trip-off.
Okay.
You didn't miss a lot by not going, to be honest. My brother was in Singapore, and he was only for a couple of days in Singapore, and he asked me, obviously, like, there is Universal Studios, shall I go there? And I advised him, go to another one. If you really want to experience the Universal Studios, go to Orlando, or go to one of the other ones, or maybe even in the future go to England if it really happens. But I said to him, skip this one. For a park that does a lot what other parks also do, and actually that does it a bit worse than what other parks also do or show, it's, for me, it's not a place that you should make the trip for. But not to say that Singapore as a city is, for me, a place that is worth to make the trip for.
So what's next?
Yeah, we would definitely like to also highlight the city of Singapore a bit more. And don't get me wrong, even though this park maybe wasn't satisfactory as a quality theme park, it's still really interesting to have been here. I'm really happy that I'm able to cross it off my list.
And this seems like a nice point to close the episode with. And as always,
our tip,
go on and plan your next trip.